The wind screamed through the mountain pass like a living thing, carrying with it shards of ice that cut exposed skin and turned breath to frozen mist before it could leave the lungs. Alara pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders, the fabric doing little to ward off the brutal cold that had descended on the northern villages 3 weeks earlier than anyone could remember. The basket on her arm held the last of her meager offerings, things she could barely afford to give but refused to withhold. A small loaf of black bread baked from the coarse grain she'd ground herself, a bundle of dried mountain flowers she'd preserved from summer, and a clay cup of honey mead that had taken her a month to trade for. The other villagers would call her a fool if they knew where she was going, what she was doing with resources that could keep her alive another few days. They already called her worse things. The path to the old shrine was overgrown and treacherous, buried under fresh snow that concealed roots and stones waiting to turn an ankle or worse. No one had walked this way in years, perhaps decades. The shrine itself was a relic from an age the village elders dismissed as superstition, a time when their ancestors believed in powers beyond human understanding and made offerings to entities that dwelt in the eternal ice. Alara had been 7 years old when her grandmother first brought her here. The old woman's hands gnarled and shaking as she placed dried berries and mountain sage on the weathered stone altar. Her grandmother had whispered the old prayers, words in a language half forgotten, speaking to something she called the Warden of Winter, the frozen guardian, the beast who remembers. The village had mocked her grandmother then, just as they mocked Alara now, calling them both mad women clinging to fairy tales, while the real world demanded practical solutions to practical problems. Her grandmother had died that same winter, fever taking her, in the night while Alara held her hand and begged her not to leave. With her last breath, the old woman had gripped Alara's wrist with surprising strength and made her promise to continue the offerings, to maintain the prayers, to never let the old ways die completely. For 15 years, Alara had kept that promise, even as her parents perished in a rockslide when she was 12. Even as the village gradually excluded her from their community, treating her devotion to ancient ritual as a sign of instability, or worse. She lived on the outskirts now, in a cottage that had belonged to her grandmother, surviving on what little work the villagers would give her and the vegetables she could coax from the rocky soil during the brief mountain summer. The shrine came into view through the swirling snow, a structure of dark stone carved with symbols that time and weather had nearly erased. It stood in a clearing surrounded by ancient pines, their branches heavy with ice that glittered in the weak afternoon light. At the center of the clearing rose something that made Alara's breath catch every time she saw it. A massive formation of ice that seemed to pulse with an inner luminescence, blue and white and silver all at once. The ice had been here longer than anyone could remember, longer than the village itself according to the oldest records. It rose 30 feet into the air, a frozen cascade that never melted even in high summer. And if you looked closely, if you let your eyes adjust to the strange light within it, you could almost see shapes, almost see something vast and terrible and beautiful, trapped within the eternal frost. Alara approached the altar with the reverence her grandmother had taught her, setting down her basket and arranging the offerings with careful precision. The bread went to the east, the flowers to the north, the mead to the west. She knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold that immediately began to seep through her worn skirt, and pressed her palms together. The prayer came as naturally as breathing, words she had spoken countless times, but never with less than complete sincerity. She spoke in the old tongue, the language her grandmother had taught her syllable by syllable, asking for protection for her village, for mercy from the brutal winter, for the strength to endure another season. She thanked the frozen guardian for watching over them even as they forgot, for maintaining the barrier between the world of warmth and the realm of eternal ice, where darker things dwelt. As always, there was no response. The ice formation stood silent and unmoved. The clearing remained empty except for falling snow, and Alara felt the familiar mix of faith and loneliness that accompanied these visits. She never expected an answer, had never received any sign that her prayers reached anyone or anything, but she continued because her grandmother had believed with such fierce certainty, and because letting go of this last connection to her family felt like a betrayal she could not commit. She stayed kneeling for several minutes more, letting the cold settle into her bones, before finally rising and preparing to make the long walk back to her cottage. If you're watching this and finding comfort in Alara's dedication, take a moment to share your own stories of faith or tradition in the comments below. I'd love to hear what keeps you connected to something larger than yourself. The village was in chaos when she returned. People, running through the narrow streets with torches and weapons, voices raised in fear and confusion. Alara grabbed the arm of Marta, the baker's wife who had always been slightly less hostile than the others, demanding to know what had happened. Marta's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, as she explained that something had attacked the southern watchtower just after sunset. Not bandits or wolves or any natural threat, but creatures that seemed made of shadow and frost, things that moved through the darkness with inhuman speed and left men frozen solid where they stood. The village militia had tried to fight them, had lost 3 men in the first minutes of combat, their bodies found sheathed in ice so thick it took axes to break them free. Elder Petrov had called an emergency council, and even Alara was expected to attend given that every able body in the village might be needed for whatever was coming. The council hall was packed with frightened people, the air thick with smoke from the central fire and the stench of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Petrov stood at the front, a man of 60 winters with a face like weathered granite and a voice that commanded attention even in crisis. He explained what they knew, which was precious little. The creatures had come from the high passes, from the direction of the ancient glacier fields where no one ventured anymore. They seemed drawn to warmth and life, and conventional weapons did little to slow them. Fire worked to some degree, but the things could extinguish flames with a breath of Arctic wind that froze moisture in the air. The arguments began immediately, some villagers insisting they should flee south to the lowland cities, others declaring that the journey would kill them in this weather and they should fortify the village instead. Alara listened to the debate spiral into accusation and panic, watching her neighbors turn on each other as fear eroded the thin bonds of community that held them together. Finally, unable to contain herself any longer, she stood and raised her voice above the din. She told them about the old stories, about the frozen guardian that was said to protect these mountains from the creatures that dwelt in the deepest ice, about the shrine and the ancient compact that their ancestors had honored, but they had forgotten. The reaction was immediate and vicious. Petrov's face turned red with rage as he shouted her down, calling her a superstitious fool peddling children's tales while people died. Others joined in, years of resentment and mockery, finding outlet in this moment of crisis. They blamed her prayers for angering whatever spirits dwelt in the mountains, blamed her grandmother for filling her head with nonsense, blamed her for wasting resources on offerings that could have strengthened the village stores. One man, Dmitri the blacksmith, whose son had been among those killed at the watchtower, grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her violently, demanding to know if her frozen beast would bring his boy back to life. Alara fled the hall with tears freezing on her cheeks, shame and anger and desperate certainty warring in her chest. She knew what she had to do, even if it cost her everything. Even if she was wrong and the villagers were right and she was just a mad woman talking to ice and empty air. She ran through the darkening streets, past the shuttered houses and frightened faces peering through windows, heading for the path that led to the shrine. The temperature had dropped further, the cold so intense it burned her lungs with each breath, and the sky above churned with unnatural clouds that seemed to pulse with sickly green light. The journey to the shrine took twice as long in the darkness, Alara stumbling over hidden obstacles and nearly losing the path several times. When she finally reached the clearing, she found it transformed into something from a nightmare. The ancient pines were coated in frost, so thick their branches sagged toward the ground, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with ice crystals that caught and fractured the moonlight into 1,000 colors. The massive ice formation at the clearing's center blazed with inner light now, brighter than she had ever seen it, and for the first time in 15 years of visits, Alara could clearly see what was trapped inside. If this scene is giving you chills, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think is about to happen. It was massive, easily twice the height of a man, and its form was both terrible and magnificent. She could see the outline of a humanoid shape, but one transformed by power or curse into something beyond mortal. Great antlers or horns swept back from its head. Its body was corded with muscle and covered in what might have been fur or scales or armor of living ice, and its hands ended in claws that looked capable of rending stone. Its face was partially visible, noble and fierce and inhumanly beautiful, with eyes closed as if in sleep, but somehow conveying an impression of ancient sorrow and terrible patience. This was no mindless beast, no simple guardian animal. This had been something more, someone who had chosen or been forced into this frozen imprisonment. Alara collapsed at the altar, her strength finally giving out, and the words that came were not the formal prayers her grandmother had taught her, but a raw plea from the depths of her soul. She begged the frozen guardian to wake, to save her people even though they had forgotten and mocked and abandoned the old ways. She offered everything she had, her life, her service, whatever price needed to be paid for its intervention. She wept as she spoke, 15 years of loneliness and faith and stubborn hope pouring out in a torrent of desperate prayer. She told the frozen form that she had never stopped believing, had never let the offerings cease, had kept the memory alive even when it cost her everything else. The ground beneath her began to tremble, a low vibration that built in intensity until loose snow was dancing on the stones of the altar. The ice formation's light grew blinding, blue-white radiance that turned night to day and cast stark shadows across the clearing. Cracks appeared in the eternal frost, hairline fractures that spread and widened with sounds like thunder, and then the ice shattered outward in an explosion that sent Alara tumbling backward. She threw her arms up to protect. Her face from flying shards felt dozens of tiny cuts open on her exposed skin, and when she finally lowered her hands and looked, her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The frozen guardian stood before her, freed from its prison of ice, and the reality of it was so much more overwhelming than the glimpse she had caught through the frost. It towered over her, its body radiating cold so intense that her breath froze solid and fell as snow, but beneath the fearsome exterior she could see traces of what it had been. The structure of its face, the set of its shoulders, the way it held itself all spoke of a warrior's pride and discipline. Its eyes, when they opened and fixed on her, were the blue of glacial ice lit from within, ancient and knowing, and filled with such complex emotion that Alara felt her heart clench. The guardian spoke, and its voice was like the grinding of icebergs, the howl of blizzard winds. But underneath, there was something unmistakably human. It asked who had woken it, who had called it forth with prayers spoken in the old tongue, and offerings given with pure heart. Alara found her voice somehow, though she had to force the words past chattering teeth and frost forming on her lips. She told it her name, told it about the creatures attacking her village, told it about 15 years of faithful offerings and the promise she had kept to her grandmother. She asked, with all the desperate courage she could gather, if it would help them. The guardian was silent for a long moment, its massive head tilting as it studied her with those crystalline eyes. Then it spoke again, and this time Alara heard curiosity and something that might have been wonder. It told her that it had been aware during its imprisonment, conscious but unable to move or act, listening to prayers that had grown fewer and fewer over the centuries until only she remained. It had felt her offerings, heard her words, sensed her faith when all others had turned away. It asked why she had continued when there was no answer, no sign, no reward for her devotion. Alara met its eyes without flinching, finding a strength in this moment that she had not known she possessed. She told the truth, that she had continued because her grandmother believed, because the old ways deserved to be remembered, because faith did not require proof or reward to have meaning. She had felt, in some way she could not explain, that the prayers mattered, that something was listening, even if it never responded, that maintaining the connection between her people and the ancient powers was important, even if she was the only one who still cared. The guardian moved then, lowering itself until its enormous face was level with hers, and reached out one clawed hand with surprising gentleness. It touched her cheek with a single talon, the contact so cold it burned, but Alara did not pull away. The guardian spoke words in the old tongue, words that Alara only partially understood, but that resonated in her bones and blood. It told her that she carried something in her veins, a heritage she did not know, a connection to the ancient compact that went deeper than simple faith. It told her that the creatures attacking her village were spawn of the void beyond winter, entities that had been sealed away when the guardian accepted its frozen imprisonment 1,000 years before, and that the seal was breaking because the prayers and offerings that maintained it had ceased. The full weight of understanding hit Alara like a physical blow. The offerings had not been superstition or empty ritual. They had been part of a magical compact, a binding that required faith and remembrance to maintain its strength. By forgetting, by abandoning the old ways, her people had weakened the barrier between worlds, had allowed the void creatures to slip through and threaten everything. And she, with her stubborn devotion and her grandmother's teachings, had been the last thread holding the seal together, had kept it intact just long enough for this moment. The guardian rose to its full height again and looked toward the south, toward the village hidden in the valley below. It told Alara that it would defend her people, would drive back the void creatures and restore the seal. But there was a price. The curse that bound it could not be fully broken by force or time, only by willing sacrifice freely given by one who shared the bloodline of the original compact makers. It needed her, not just her faith, but her essence. Her life force mingled with its own to complete a transformation that would restore what had been lost and heal what had been broken. Alara did not hesitate, did not question or bargain or ask for time to consider. She told the guardian to take whatever it needed, that her life was a small price for the salvation of her people and the restoration of the ancient balance. She had been prepared to die alone and unmourned in her grandmother's cottage, forgotten by the community she had tried to protect. And if her death could have meaning and purpose, could be the final offering that mattered, then she would give it gladly. The guardian made a sound that might have been pain or regret, and it told her that she did not understand, that the price was not her death, but something more complex and binding. It extended its hand to her, palm up, and asked if she truly consented to join with it, to become part of what it was, to share the burden of guardianship. In the isolation of immortal duty, Alara looked at that massive hand, clawed and terrible and somehow unutterably lonely, and she understood. This was not a simple transaction of life for power. This was an offer of partnership, of sharing the weight that this being had carried alone for 1,000 years. She placed her small hand in its palm and spoke the words of consent in the old tongue, phrases her grandmother had taught her without explaining their full meaning. The moment she completed the binding phrase, power surged through her like lightning through a rod, and she gasped as her vision exploded into something far beyond normal sight. She could see the magical fabric of the world, the currents of power that flowed through earth and air and ice, the threads of the ancient compact that connected the shrine to the mountains to the barrier between worlds. She could feel the guardian's memories pouring into her mind. 1,000 years of isolation and duty and unending vigilance. But beneath it all, older and more precious, the memory of who this being had been before the curse. His name had been Corian, and he had been the greatest warrior of his age, champion of the mountain kingdoms that existed before the current villages were even conceived. When the rifts to the void beyond winter had opened, and creatures of living entropy poured through to consume the world, Corian had led the defense, had bought time for the mages and priests to devise a solution. The solution had required a guardian, an immortal watcher who would stand eternal vigil at the boundaries between worlds, and the transformation into such a being required a sacrifice that would strip away mortality and humanity alike. Corian had volunteered, had walked into the ritual chamber knowing he would never walk out as himself again, had accepted the fusion of human soul and primal winter force, because someone had to, and he could not ask another to bear what he would not. The woman he loved, a priestess named Elira, who had helped design the binding ritual, had tried to stop him. She had argued that there must be another way, that losing him was too high a price even for the world's salvation. But Corian had been adamant. He made her promise to continue her life, to find happiness, to not mourn him as dead when he was simply changed. Elira had lived another 50 years, had married, and had children and grandchildren, and on her deathbed, she had extracted a promise from her descendants. They would maintain the offerings, would speak the prayers, would ensure that Corian's sacrifice was remembered and honored. For generations, the promise had been kept, the bloodline of Elira maintaining the compact, until time and human forgetfulness had eroded the commitment to ritual without understanding. Elira's grandmother had been of Elira's line, had carried the blood memory, even if she did not know the full history, and she had passed that heritage to Elira, along with the prayers and offerings. That was why Elira's faith had mattered more than others, why her prayers had reached through the ice when thousands of more eloquent pleas had failed. She was blood calling to blood, the descendant of the woman Corian had loved, reaching across a millennium to the being he had become. The power transfer completed, and Elira felt her body changing, felt winter's essence mingling with her humanity, not to replace it, but to augment it. She would not become what Corian was, would not lose herself in the transformation, but she would become something new, a bridge between human and guardian that could help him maintain the balance without bearing the full curse. Her body filled with strength, her senses expanded to encompass the entire mountain range, and she could feel the void creatures like cancers on the fabric of reality, their wrongness screaming against her newly awakened awareness. Corian's voice in her mind was warm with emotion he had not felt in centuries, gratitude and wonder and something that might have been hope. He told her they had work to do, creatures to banish and seals to restore, and she felt his eagerness not just for the battle, but for the simple fact of not being alone, of having a partner in the endless duty. Together they moved, not walking, but flowing across the snow like winter wind given purpose, and Elira learned to wield the power now burning in her veins. She could freeze the air with a thought, could call blizzards and ice storms, could see through the darkness and perceive the void creatures' weaknesses. The battle for the village was brief, but spectacular, Corian and Elira working in perfect synchronization to drive back the shadow things that had been besieging the walls. Villagers who had mocked Elira's faith watched in awe and terror as she stood beside the frozen guardian, wielding power that lit up the night sky with aurora lights and turned the attacking creatures to ice sculptures that shattered in the wind. Corian's roar shook the mountains as he channeled 1,000 years of pent-up purpose into devastating attacks, his joy at finally being able to act, to fight, to protect after so long frozen and helpless, was palpable in every movement. When the last void creature had been banished back to the spaces between realities and the temporary rifts sealed, Corian and Elira stood before the assembled villagers, an impossible pair that radiated enough power to make the bravest warrior take an involuntary step backward. Elder Petrov fell to his knees, shame and recognition warring on his weathered face as he understood what they had almost lost, what Elira's despised faith had preserved through their long forgetting. He begged forgiveness with tears freezing on his cheeks, and others followed, the entire village prostrating themselves before the guardian they had dismissed as fairy tale, and the woman they had scorned as mad. Elira felt no satisfaction in their abasement, only a deep weariness and a strange sense of completion. She told them to rise, told them that punishment served no purpose, but understanding might. She explained the history, the compact, the necessity of remembrance and offering to maintain the seals that kept them safe. She told them that she would not be returning to her cottage, that her role now was to stand with Corian, to help him guard the boundaries and maintain the balance that protected not just their village, but the entire region. The following days were a flurry of activity as the village transformed its relationship with the old ways. The shrine was restored and expanded, Volunteers came forward to help maintain it and learn the prayers that Alara taught them. Offerings flowed in steady stream, not from obligation or fear, but from genuine gratitude and understanding. Alara visited when she could, teaching the willing and accepting their questions. But she spent most of her time with Corian, learning the full scope of their guardianship and settling into the strange new reality of her existence. The relationship between them grew in ways that surprised them both. Corian had expected their partnership to be purely functional, a necessary division of labor to maintain the wards and respond to threats. But he found himself drawn to Alara's humor and humanity, the way she saw wonder in the frozen landscapes he had long since stopped noticing, the question she asked that made him reconsider, assumptions 1,000 years old. Alara discovered that beneath the fearsome exterior and the weight of ancient duty, Corian retained a core of himself that was thoughtful and kind, that mourned the life he had given up, but did not regret the choice, that carried loneliness like a wound that had never healed. One night, as they stood watch over the mountain passes under stars that blazed in the thin air, Alara asked Corian about Aelira, about the love he had left behind. He was quiet for a long moment before answering, his voice holding a quality of old pain carefully examined and accepted. He told her that loving Aelira had been the greatest joy of his mortal existence, that walking away from her had been the hardest part of the transformation, harder even than losing his human form. He had watched her through the years when he could, had seen her build a life and family, and though it had hurt to see her with another, he had been glad she found happiness. Alara felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she listened, understanding the depth of sacrifice in a new way. She asked, with careful hesitation, if he had been alone in the ice all that time, if no one had reached him or spoken to him, or offered companionship across the centuries. Corian turned to look at her, his crystalline eyes reflecting the starlight, and he told her that she was the first, the only one whose voice had pierced the isolation, whose presence he had felt even through the frozen prison. He did not say more, but something in his gaze and the gentleness of his tone made Alara's heart beat faster. The truth came to them gradually, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of shared experiences and quiet conversations, in the way they moved together in battle and the comfort they found in each other's company during the long watches. Corian realized that what he felt was not simply gratitude or the relief of partnership, but something deeper and more precious, an emotion he had thought lost to him forever. Alara recognized that her faith had always been reaching for him specifically, that some part of her had been calling to Corian across time and distance, drawn by blood memory and something more personal than destiny. The night Alara finally spoke the words, admitting that she loved him, that she had perhaps always loved him in some way that transcended rational explanation, Corian wept for the first time in a millennium. Tears of pure ice fell from his eyes and turned to diamonds where they struck the ground, and he told her that he had not dared to hope for such a gift, that loving Aelira had been his past, but loving Alara could be both present and future, if she would have him. She answered by taking his massive hands in her smaller ones and pulling him down until their foreheads touched, human warmth and winter cold meeting in perfect balance. Their relationship was unlike any love story in human memory. Two beings transformed by magic and duty, learning to build something beautiful within the constraints of their guardianship. They could not have the simple domestic life Alara had once dreamed of, could not grow old together in a cottage with children playing in the garden, but they had something rarer and more profound. They had absolute trust, perfect understanding, and the knowledge that they faced eternity together, two parts of a whole that made the burden of guardianship bearable and even joyful. The villagers grew accustomed to seeing them together, the massive frost guardian and the woman who glowed with winter light, making their rounds of the mountain passes or standing watch over the shrine. Children brought offerings and stayed to listen when Alara told stories of the ancient compact and the heroes who had saved the world at terrible personal cost. The shrine became a place of learning and community, a reminder that some things were larger than individual lives, and that faith, when grounded in truth and maintained, with sincere heart, could literally move mountains. Years passed, then decades, and Alara did not age as normal humans did, the power she shared with Corian preserving her in a state between mortal and immortal. She watched the children she had taught grow old and bring their own grandchildren to learn the prayers, watched the village expand and prosper under the protection she and Corian provided. There were more attacks over the years, void creatures testing the barriers and, occasionally, finding weak points, but each incursion was met and defeated, the seals strengthened by the renewed faith and understanding of the people who had once forgotten. On the 50th anniversary of her transformation, Alara stood with Corian at the shrine as the village held a festival of remembrance and thanksgiving. She watched them dance and feast, celebrating the compact that kept them safe and honoring the guardians who maintained the watch, and she felt a contentment that went soul deep. She had been so lonely for so long, scorned and dismissed and isolated by her faith, and now she was surrounded by community and purpose, and a love that defied every limitation. Corian drew her close, his massive form curling protectively around her, and he spoke words that had waited 1,000 years to be said. He told her that when he had accepted the transformation, had walked into the ritual knowing what he would lose, he had believed love was one of the things he would have to sacrifice. Forever, he had resigned himself to an existence of duty without companionship, purpose without warmth, and he had thought that was the necessary price. But she had proven him wrong, had shown that even curses could be transformed by faith and connection, that love could exist in forms he had never imagined. Alara turned in his embrace and kissed him, human lips meeting winter cold, and felt the familiar surge of power and rightness that accompanied their joining. She told him that she had prayed to a frozen beast no one believed in, had kept faith when there was no reason to expect reward, and she had received something more precious than she had ever dared to dream. She had found her purpose, her power, and her partner, had discovered that the thing she was meant to do and the person she was meant to love were miraculously the same. The epilogue of their story is written in the continued peace of the mountain villages, in the shrine that never lacks for offerings or sincere prayers, in the children who grow up knowing that faith and duty are not burdens, but privileges when undertaken with full heart. Corian and Alara stand their eternal watch, defenders against the void and living proof that transformation can be chosen rather than endured, that partnership can make any burden lighter, and that love, when it finds the right vessel, can survive anything, even death, even 1,000 years of frozen imprisonment, even the transformation from human to something far stranger and more wonderful. If their journey has touched your heart, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories of love that transcends all boundaries. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that faith, even when tested, can lead to miracles beyond imagination.